On a freezing December morning in 1944, a German officer stood in the snow outside the besieged Belgian town of Bastogne. He carried a white flag and a formal ultimatum demanding the surrender of the surrounded American forces. The 101st Airborne Division was encircled, outnumbered, low on ammunition, and running out of medical supplies. The German commander was confident. Everything he had been taught about Americans told him they would see reason. They were, after all, businessmen at heart, practical people. They would calculate the odds and make the sensible choice. The American acting division commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, read the surrender demand. His reply consisted of a single word: nuts. The German officers who received this response had to ask what it meant. When they finally understood, they returned to their lines bewildered. This was not how Americans were supposed to behave. 7,000 miles away and 2 years earlier, Joseph Goebbels had published an essay in the Nazi newspaper Das Reich explaining exactly what kind of people the Americans were. Their greatest technical accomplishments, he wrote, are refrigerators and radios. The United States has no poets, no painters, no architects or composers of world stature. Whatever culture it has is borrowed from Europe. If the Americans lacked money, they would probably be the most despised people in the world. Goebbels was certain about one thing: these soft, materialistic people could never match German soldiers on the battlefield. He was catastrophically wrong. And the story of how the Wehrmacht and the SS discovered just how wrong is one of the most dramatic reversals of military perception in modern history. The German misjudgment of American soldiers did not emerge from ignorance. It emerged from ideology. Nazi racial theory provided a comprehensive framework for understanding national strength. In this worldview, military capability flowed directly from racial purity. Germany, with its supposed Aryan bloodline, possessed inherent superiority that would manifest on any battlefield. America, by contrast, was a mongrel nation, a polyglot mixture of races and ethnicities that could never achieve the unity of purpose required for sustained warfare. Adolf Hitler expressed this view repeatedly in private conversations recorded by his inner circle. He dismissed American military capability, insisting that Americans had not played a significant role in the First World War and had not made great sacrifices of blood. Their fighting qualities were low, he believed. He described America as lacking any unified national identity, dismissing it as nothing but a mass of immigrants from many nations and races who could never cohere into a genuine fighting force. This analysis carried weight because it came wrapped in the authority of experience. German veterans of 1918 remembered the American doughboys who had arrived late, fought briefly, and returned home to parades. The institutional memory of the German officer corps held that American soldiers were enthusiastic but undisciplined, brave but poorly trained, numerous but ultimately incapable of the kind of sustained combat that had defined the Western Front. The German army that marched into Poland in 1939 was the product of decades of professional development. Its officers had studied war as a science. Its non-commissioned officers maintained traditions stretching back to Frederick the Great. Its soldiers had been trained to standards that made the Wehrmacht, in the assessment of many military historians, the finest fighting force in the world on a man-for-man basis. Against this background, American military preparation seemed almost comically inadequate. In 1939, the United States Army ranked 19th in the world in terms of size, smaller than the Army of Portugal. Its equipment was obsolete. Its doctrine had not been updated since the First World War. Its officer corps was small and aging, its promotion system glacially slow. George Marshall, who would become Chief of Staff, had endured 15 years in the rigid interwar seniority system, reverting from temporary wartime colonel back to captain after 1918, and not regaining that rank permanently until 1933. The contrast with the dynamic, expanding Wehrmacht could not have been sharper. German military attaches who had observed American forces during the interwar years sent back reports that reinforced the prevailing assumptions. The Americans lacked the military tradition that defined German identity. They had no Prussian heritage of professional arms. Their society celebrated businessmen and entertainers rather than soldiers. Their young men aspired to commercial success rather than military glory. Everything about American culture suggested a people unsuited for the demands of modern warfare. The contempt ran deep because it served psychological needs. German soldiers facing the prospect of fighting a two-front war required reassurance that at least one of their enemies could be dismissed. The Americans fit the bill perfectly. They were dollar soldiers, comfortable civilians playing at war, men whose society had made them soft in ways that no amount of equipment could overcome. But embedded in German military archives was a warning that went largely unheeded. After the First World War, American intelligence had compiled a report titled Candid Comment on the American Soldier of 1917 to 1918. It contained assessments gathered from German officers, soldiers, and civilians who had encountered American troops. A German general's chief of staff admitted that Americans had been the bravest of our enemies, and in fact the only ones who have attacked us seriously in this year's battles. Lieutenant of Reserve Arnulf Oster called them good fighters with nerve and recklessness. This institutional memory existed. It was simply overwhelmed by ideology. The fatal flaw in German thinking was a category error so fundamental that it shaped every subsequent misjudgment. German commanders measured American potential by American performance in peacetime. They saw a nation that had not mobilized and concluded it could not mobilize. They saw factories making consumer goods and assumed those factories could not make weapons. They saw diversity and believed diversity meant weakness. They saw comfort and concluded that comfortable people could not sacrifice. They were looking at the wrong America. The America that mattered was not the America of their assumptions, it was the America that would emerge under pressure. The first test came in North Africa. In February 1943, American forces met the Wehrmacht in sustained ground combat for the first time at a place called Kasserine Pass. The results appeared to confirm everything Germans believed about their new enemy. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Corps tore through the American positions with professional precision. The German attack exploited every weakness the inexperienced Americans displayed. Poor camouflage discipline made units visible for miles. Artillery was badly positioned. Infantry dug foxholes in the wrong places. Coordination between tanks and foot soldiers collapsed under pressure. American units bunched together in ways that made them perfect targets for pre-registered German guns. The numbers told a story of disaster. Roughly 6,500 American casualties, including 3,000 captured, 183 American tanks destroyed. German losses were a fraction of that figure. Rommel's staff began referring to the Americans as a hollow force instead of a formidable enemy. The German attack had exploited weaknesses that seemed to validate every pre-war assumption. American officers had positioned their forces poorly, spreading them thin across terrain that favored concentrated assault. Radio communications broke down under pressure. Units that should have supported each other fought in isolation. American tank crews charged German positions without infantry support and paid the predictable price. The coordination between arms that defined German combined arms warfare was almost entirely absent from American operations. Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, who happened to be General Patton's son-in-law, led an armoured counterattack at Sidi Bou Zid that ran directly into a German ambush. Panzers and anti-tank guns positioned in a classic killing zone destroyed American tanks as they advanced. Waters was wounded and captured, spending the rest of the war in a German prison camp. His fate symbolized the experience of many American officers who discovered that peacetime training had not prepared them for combat against professionals. German prisoners taken later in the campaign reported their surprise at American logistics. Despite the tactical failures, American forces seemed to possess unlimited ammunition, unlimited fuel, and unlimited food. When German units ran short of supplies, they improvised or did without. When American units ran short, replacement supplies arrived within days. This material abundance, the Germans were learning, could compensate for many tactical shortcomings. German intelligence officers compiled reports for Berlin that said exactly what Hitler wanted to hear. The Americans were indeed soft. Their equipment was abundant, but their soldiers were weak. German fighting quality would triumph over American material power, just as the Führer had predicted. But Rommel himself saw something his subordinates missed. He was too good a general to let first impressions harden into permanent conclusions. In his journal, He recorded an observation that contradicted the prevailing German analysis. "The tactical conduct of the enemy defense had been first class," he wrote. "They had recovered very quickly after the first shock, and had soon succeeded in damming up our advance by grouping their reserves to defend the passes and other suitable points." Rommel noted that one American armored unit had been employed very skillfully. He praised American equipment, observing that British experience had been put to good use in American designs. He watched American artillery observation aircraft direct devastating battery fire across the entire zone and recognized the tactical sophistication this implied. Most importantly, Rommel watched what happened after the battle ended, and what he saw troubled him deeply. The Americans recovered with a speed that violated everything German experience suggested was possible. Within weeks, the defeated force had reorganized completely. General Lloyd Fredendall, who had commanded the disaster, was relieved and sent home. George Patton arrived like a thunderstorm, demanding discipline, punishing sloppiness, and driving his men to standards they had never met. But Patton did more than impose order. He studied why the Americans had failed and implemented specific corrections. Artillery forward observers were repositioned, tank tactics were revised. Infantry learned to coordinate more closely with armor. The lessons of Kasserine were analyzed, documented, and disseminated through the entire force. Rommel later recorded his revised assessment. In Tunisia, the Americans had to pay a stiff price for their experience, but it brought rich dividends. Even at that time, the American generals showed themselves to be very advanced in the tactical handling of their forces. He added a phrase that revealed genuine respect. "We had to wait until the Patton army in France to see the most astonishing achievements in mobile warfare." By May of 1943, just 3 months after the debacle at Kasserine, the war in North Africa was over. Nearly 240,000 German and Italian soldiers marched into prisoner of war camps. It was a larger surrender than Stalingrad. The Americans who had panicked in February were now among the victors. The pattern Rommel observed would repeat throughout the war. American forces stumbled initially, learned rapidly, and improved continuously. The same troops who had fled from German tanks in Tunisia would storm the beaches of Normandy and fight their way across France. The same pilots who had been outmaneuvered by experienced Luftwaffe veterans would eventually sweep the German Air Force from the skies. Sicily came next, in July of 1943. Major General Lucien Truscott's 3rd Infantry Division, spearheading Patton's 7th Army, covered 100 miles in 72 hours to seize Palermo, demonstrating a tempo of operations that forced German commanders to revise their assumptions about American aggressiveness. The race to Messina revealed an American general willing to push his forces at speeds that matched anything the Wehrmacht could achieve. The grinding Italian campaign that followed tested a different American quality. At Anzio, at the Winter Line, at Monte Cassino, American troops demonstrated the endurance under prolonged attritional warfare that Germans had initially doubted they possessed. Month after month, in terrain that favored the defender, against fortifications designed to bleed any attacker dry, American soldiers kept fighting. They were learning the brutal lessons of modern war, the only way such lessons can be learned. And they were surviving the education. But it was Normandy that shattered what remained of German illusions. On the morning of June 6, 1944, German defenders along the Normandy coast stared at the English Channel and saw something that defied comprehension. Ships. More ships than they had ever seen, more ships than they had imagined could exist. A fleet so vast, it seemed to cover the sea from horizon to horizon. German officers reported to their commands that this was the invasion, and that its scale exceeded anything they had prepared for. The scale of the Allied invasion force defied German comprehension. Over 156,000 troops crossed the Channel on the first day. They were supported by nearly 7,000 naval vessels and 11,000 aircraft. Floating tanks swam ashore under their own power. Prefabricated harbors materialized on the beaches within days. American forces operated without a single horse in an era when the Wehrmacht still depended on animal transport for most of its logistics. German soldiers who had been fed propaganda about soft, materialistic Americans found themselves facing an industrial civilization at war. The complete motorization of the American army was itself a shock. German units that had marched across Europe on foot, their supplies drawn by horses, confronted an enemy where every soldier seemed to have a vehicle, and every vehicle seemed to be endlessly replaceable. The Norman hedgerow country initially appeared to favour the defenders. The boscage was ancient farmland divided by earthen embankments topped with dense vegetation. Each field was a natural fortress. German forces had pre-registered their artillery on every hedgerow gap, every road intersection, and every likely avenue of approach. American tanks could not push through the embankments. Infantry that tried to cross the gaps were cut down by pre-sighted machine guns. American casualties mounted at a horrifying rate. The majority of Normandy losses came from enemy artillery and mortars firing at hedgerow gaps. The advance measured progress in hedgerows taken rather than miles gained. German defenders began to believe that the boscage would bleed the invasion to death. Then something happened that epitomized everything the Germans had failed to understand about American adaptability. A sergeant named Curtis Cullen, inspired by a suggestion from another soldier, welded sections of German beach obstacle steel to the front of a Sherman tank, creating tusks that could slice through hedgerow embankments rather than climbing over them. Similar innovations emerged independently from multiple American units. Within days, the design Cullen demonstrated had spread through the American forces. Tanks fitted with these improvised devices, nicknamed rhinos, began carving paths directly through the boscage. The German defensive system, designed around the assumption that tanks could not penetrate hedgerows, began to collapse. The breaking point came on July 25 with Operation Cobra. Over 2,000 American aircraft, including 1,500 heavy bombers, dropped more than 4,000 tons of explosives on German positions west of St. Lo. Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the elite Panzer Lehr Division, provided one of the most vivid German accounts of what American firepower could achieve. The well-dug-in infantry was smashed by the heavy bombs in their foxholes and dugouts, or killed and buried by blast, he wrote. The whole bombed area was transformed into fields covered with craters in which no human being was alive. Tanks and guns were destroyed and overturned. The bombing turned the front into what Bayerlein called a landscape on the moon. At least 70% of his personnel were out of action. His report to Field Marshal von Kluge was the epitaph for German assumptions about American soldiers. My grenadiers and my pioneers and my anti-tank gunners they are holding. Not a single man is leaving his post. Not one. They are lying in their foxholes, mute and silent, for they are dead. You may report to the Field Marshal that the Panzer Lehr Division is annihilated. The American breakout that followed advanced 15 miles in 3 days. At the Falaise Pocket, German forces suffered their greatest defeat in the West. Over 10,000 Germans were killed and 50,000 captured. The carnage was so complete that General Eisenhower later described the roads through the pocket as scenes that could be described only by Dante. It was literally possible to walk for hundreds of yards at a time, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. Alfred Jodl, operations chief of the German High Command, later confessed in captivity that the war was already lost in the West at the time of the breakthrough. German soldiers learned to fear not the American rifleman, but the American system. They developed a hierarchy of respect for specific American capabilities, and at the top of that hierarchy stood American artillery. From Rommel in North Africa to the last defenders of the Reich, German soldiers testified to the devastating effectiveness of American guns. The difference lay not in the weapons themselves, but in the system that employed them. American artillery operated through a network of forward observers carrying radios connected to fire direction centers that could mass multiple batteries on a single target within minutes. A request for fire support could bring the guns of an entire division crashing down on one map coordinate. German artillery, by contrast, relied on telephone lines that were constantly being cut by enemy fire. German observers lacked the portable radios that gave American spotters their lethal mobility. German fire direction was decentralized in ways that made massing multiple batteries difficult and slow. The Americans had developed something called time-on-target fire. Multiple batteries would time their volleys so that all the shells arrived simultaneously. There was no warning. No first round to send men diving for cover. The entire barrage landed at once, catching troops in the open. German frontline soldiers learned that the sound they feared most was not gunfire, but the crackle of an American walkie-talkie. That sound meant an observer had spotted them. Within minutes, steel would be falling from the sky in quantities that seemed inexhaustible. During the Battle of the Bulge, the Americans deployed a new weapon that broke German morale in units that faced it. The proximity fuse, designated VT for variable time, had been developed in secret and was first approved for use in ground artillery combat in Europe during the Ardennes offensive. The embargo on its use over land was lifted in mid-December 1944 because commanders judged the crisis severe enough to risk the technology falling into enemy hands. The fuse caused artillery shells to detonate at optimal height above the ground rather than on impact. Troops who had survived by digging deep foxholes found that the air above them had become deadly. Tree bursts showered shrapnel downward into positions that had been safe from conventional artillery. General Patton later wrote that the proximity fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us. One German officer's observation captured the disparity with bitter clarity. He realized Germany would lose when he saw his own artillery using carefully calculated fire plans to maximize their limited ammunition, while the Americans were abandoning mountains of 155mm shells by the roadside, deeming them insufficiently important to save during a retreat. American air superiority was the other nightmare that stalked German forces from North Africa to the Rhine. Rommel understood this earliest. As early as 1942, he wrote an assessment that proved prophetic. Anyone who has to fight, even with the most modern weapons, against an enemy in complete command of the air, fights like a savage against modern European troops, under the same handicaps and with the same chances of success. By Normandy, his assessment had grown bleaker. The enemy air superiority has a very grave effect on our movements, he reported. There is simply no answer to it. Field Marshal von Kluge wrote directly to Hitler in language that bordered on desperation. In the face of the total enemy air superiority, we can adopt no tactics to compensate for the annihilating power of air except to retire from the battlefield. The cry of Achtung Jabos became a reflexive German alert. Watch out for fighter bombers. American P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs prowled the roads of France hunting anything that moved. Bayerlein described his division's road march to Normandy as a fighter-bomber race course. In hours of daylight movement, Panzer Lehr lost 84 half-tracks and self-propelled guns, 130 trucks, 40 fuel tankers, and 5 tanks. Vehicles that survived the attacks sat useless by the roadside, their crews hiding in ditches until darkness made movement possible again. Even Goebbels, the architect of the propaganda that had dismissed American capability, conceded reality by March of 1945. Again and again we return to the starting point of our conversation, he wrote in his diary. Our whole military predicament is due to enemy air superiority. Gerd von Rundstedt, the senior German commander in the West, provides a most succinct summary in his post-war interrogation. 3 factors defeated us in the West where I was in command. First, the unheard-of superiority of your air force, which made all movement in daytime impossible. Second, the lack of motor fuel so that the panzers and even the Luftwaffe were unable to move. Third, the systematic destruction of all railway communications so that it was impossible to bring one single railroad train across the Rhine. American airborne troops earned particular respect from German soldiers who fought against them. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions demonstrated a tenacity that contradicted propaganda about soft Americans. A Waffen-SS motorcycle reconnaissance driver named Eric Bessoir later recalled that his unit was fortunate not to have fought extensively against American paratroopers because they were tough opponents. Fallschirmjäger Lieutenant Eugen Scherer described combat against the 101st Airborne on D-Day as a gory battle, man against man and group against group. German assessments of American armor presented a more complicated picture. The M4 Sherman tank drew mixed reactions that evolved over the course of the war. Early encounters in North Africa produced grudging respect. The Afrika Korps war diary noted in November 1942 that American-built heavy tanks have an advantage over German tanks because they can successfully conduct a firefight at distances of over 1,000 meters. The Sherman's reliability and its gyro-stabilized gun impressed German tankers who understood the value of being able to fire accurately on the move. But by 1944, the arrival of Panthers and Tiger tanks had shifted the balance. German crews regarded the Sherman as mechanically inferior in one-on-one combat. Its armor was thinner, its gun was less powerful. A Sherman crew that encountered a Tiger at close range faced poor odds. German propaganda made much of this technical superiority, and German tank aces accumulated impressive kill totals against Allied armor. What the propaganda failed to capture was the strategic reality. American factories produced Shermans faster than German crews could destroy them. A tank lost today was replaced tomorrow. The supply of spare parts seemed inexhaustible. The logistics system that kept American armor running operated at a level of efficiency that German commanders found demoralizing. It did not matter that a Tiger could destroy 5 Shermans if 6 Shermans appeared the next morning. German tank commander accounts from Normandy consistently describe the same pattern: engage American armor, achieve tactical success, and withdraw to refuel and rearm. Discover that American strength had been completely restored. The attrition equation that German commanders calculated based on exchange ratios meant nothing when one side could replace losses and the other could not. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 should have been the Wehrmacht's vindication. Hitler had staked everything on one last offensive, gambling that a surprise attack through the Ardennes could split the Allied armies, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West. The plan depended partly on the assumption that American troops, surprised and outnumbered, would crack. On December 16, 200,000 German soldiers and nearly 1,000 tanks smashed into thinly held American lines. The surprise was total. Fog grounded Allied aircraft. German forces achieved penetrations that recalled the Blitzkrieg victories of 1940. For the first time since Normandy, the initiative belonged to the Wehrmacht. But what followed shattered remaining German illusions about American fighting spirit. At Elsenborn Ridge, the untested 99th Infantry Division, fighting alongside the veteran 2nd Infantry Division, stopped the best-equipped units of Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army. These were elite formations, the spearhead of Hitler's final gamble, and they could not break through. The German plan required rapid advance through this sector. The 99th held for 5 days, forcing the SS Panzers onto unfavorable alternative routes and wrecking the offensive's timetable. At St. Vith, American forces held a critical road junction for 5 days against overwhelming odds. The German plan had called for its capture by the 2nd day. Every hour of delay cascaded through the timetable, slowing the advance, consuming precious fuel, giving Allied commanders time to react. At Bastogne, the surrounded 101st Airborne refused to behave as encircled troops were supposed to behave. They did not surrender, they did not negotiate. When the German ultimatum arrived demanding capitulation, General McAuliffe gave his one-word answer, and his men kept fighting. The Germans were forced to bypass Bastogne, leaving a critical road junction in enemy hands, further disrupting an operation that depended on rapid movement. Then came Patton. The relief of Bastogne required one of the most remarkable feats of military logistics in the war. Patton rotated 3 entire divisions 90 degrees and launched them northward in winter conditions. Within 72 hours of receiving his orders, the attack was underway. 4 days later, on December 26, the first relief column broke through to Bastogne. The Third Army's counterattack struck the southern flank of the German penetration and began rolling back gains that had cost the Wehrmacht its last reserves. German generals who survived the war expressed their assessment of Patton in terms that bordered on admiration. General Lieutenant Gunther Blumentritt, who had served as Rundstedt's chief of staff, told the British military historian Basil Liddell Hart that the Germans regarded Patton extremely highly as the most aggressive panzer general of the Allies. His operations impressed us enormously, probably because he came closest to our own concept of the classical military commander. He even improved on Napoleon's basic tenet of activity and speed. Heinz Guderian, the father of German armoured warfare, offered similar praise during his 1945 interrogation. I hear much about General Patton, and he conducted a good campaign. From the standpoint of a tank specialist, I must congratulate him on his victory since he acted as I would have done had I been in his place. The Bulge cost Germany 200,000 casualties it could not replace, and equipment losses that gutted its remaining offensive capability. Winston Churchill called it undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war. German forces had attacked with their last reserves, had achieved complete surprise, had fought with the desperation of men defending their homeland, and they had been beaten by the soldiers they had been taught to despise. The American capacity for institutional learning operated at a speed that German military culture could not match. After Kasserine, the United States Army analyzed what had gone wrong with systematic thoroughness. Findings from the defeat were disseminated to training camps across the United States, where they shaped the preparation of divisions that had not yet deployed. The mistakes of February 1943 became the curriculum of March 1943. This feedback loop operated continuously throughout the war. After action reports from frontline units were analyzed within weeks and incorporated into revised training programs, doctrine was updated based on battlefield experience. Equipment was modified to address problems identified by soldiers in combat. Individual innovations like the Rhino tank spread through the force with remarkable speed because the system was designed to identify and propagate improvements. German military culture had ossified around fixed doctrines and personal loyalties. Initiative was discouraged. Failure could be fatal to careers and sometimes to lives. The rigidity that had produced the brilliant early victories became a liability when circumstances changed and adaptation was required. Hitler made this worse. He interfered constantly in military operations, overruling his generals based on intuition rather than analysis. Commanders learned that disagreeing with the Führer was career-ending at best and potentially lethal. The honest assessments that might have corrected German strategy were suppressed in favor of reports that told Hitler what he wanted to hear. The treatment of failure revealed the deepest difference between the two military cultures. When American commanders failed, they were relieved but rarely punished. General Fredendall, who had commanded the Kasserine disaster, was sent back to the United States to train new troops. His experience, even failed experience, was considered valuable. When German commanders failed, they risked everything. After the July 1944 assassination attempt, Hitler's paranoia intensified. Generals suspected of disloyalty were executed. Success was no guarantee of safety if it came at the cost of contradicting orders. German officers who recognized the impossibility of their strategic situation often said nothing because speaking honestly was too dangerous. Did the regular Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS view Americans differently? The evidence suggests some meaningful distinctions, though both converged toward respect by the war's end. SS soldiers, steeped in Nazi racial ideology, were more likely to maintain contemptuous attitudes toward Americans, even as battlefield realities contradicted their beliefs. The ideological framework that defined SS identity required viewing Americans as products of a degenerate multiracial society. Admitting American military capability meant questioning the racial theories that justified the SS worldview. Regular Wehrmacht soldiers tended toward more pragmatic assessments. Professional officers evaluated American performance against professional standards rather than ideological requirements. They were more willing to acknowledge American strengths because doing so did not threaten their fundamental identity. Studies of German combat effectiveness suggest that German soldiers, regardless of branch, inflicted casualties at roughly 50% higher rates than their American counterparts across all circumstances. 100 German soldiers were approximately equivalent to 120 American soldiers in direct combat effectiveness. The Germans were, man for man, better soldiers. But this tactical superiority proved strategically irrelevant. The American system of overwhelming firepower, flexible logistics, and continuous adaptation made individual combat effectiveness secondary. It did not matter that a German squad could outfight an American squad if American artillery could destroy that German squad before the infantry engagement began. The Germans won firefights, the Americans won battles. By 1945, both Wehrmacht and SS formations competed not to fight Americans but to surrender to them. The Donitz government pursued a deliberate policy of capitulating westward. German soldiers who had spent years on the Eastern Front harbored no illusions about Soviet captivity. American prisoner of war camps represented salvation by comparison. The preference for American captivity was universal across all branches of German service. One veteran captured the sentiment in simple terms. He was glad he was able to surrender to the Americans instead. German assessments of the individual American infantrymen were more nuanced than the broad praise for American firepower and logistics might suggest. Wehrmacht veterans interviewed after the war consistently noted certain characteristics that distinguished Americans from British and Soviet opponents. American infantry were described as individually less skilled in fieldcraft as their German counterparts. Their camouflage discipline was poor by German standards. They moved noisily through terrain that demanded stealth. Their patrolling was often predictable. In the craft of small unit tactics, the Germans retained a professional edge that years of combat experience had sharpened to a lethal point. But American infantry possessed qualities that offset these tactical weaknesses. German veterans consistently noted American aggressiveness. British troops, when ambushed, would return fire and edge their way to a more favorable position. Americans would return fire, call in devastating artillery or airstrikes, and then counterattack as soon as the bombardment lifted. This pattern surprised Germans accustomed to more cautious opponents. American units that should have consolidated defensive positions after taking casualties instead pressed forward into the attack. Commanders who should have paused to reorganize pushed their men onward. The relentless forward pressure wore down German defenders who had expected the normal rhythm of assault, consolidation, and preparation for the next bound. The Germans also noted American resourcefulness. Individual soldiers demonstrated a mechanical aptitude that reflected their civilian backgrounds. Equipment that German soldiers would have abandoned as broken was repaired by Americans who had grown up fixing tractors and automobiles. Improvised solutions to tactical problems appeared spontaneously throughout American units. The Rhino tank was merely the most famous example of an innovation culture that permeated American forces. The distance between Nazi propaganda and frontline reality represented one of the war's starkest cognitive dissonances. Goebbels had specifically mocked American military capability by pointing to the fall of the Philippines, where an army of 60,000 men had surrendered after what he characterized as minimal resistance. Nazi propagandists had targeted African American soldiers with leaflets exploiting American racial tensions. The domestic message portrayed Black Americans as representatives of a degenerate culture. Frontline reality demolished these narratives in stages. At Kasserine, propaganda briefly appeared validated. By Normandy, German soldiers confronted an enemy of staggering industrial power and unexpected ferocity. The prefabricated harbors that materialized on the beaches, the endless streams of replacement equipment, the air forces that turned daylight into death. None of this matched the picture of soft, materialistic amateurs that propaganda had painted. A German veteran interviewed for Jonathan Trigg's research on Normandy captured the revised assessment. "We were not afraid of the Allies as soldiers," he admitted. "But we were afraid of their materiel. It was going to be men versus machines." Stephen Ambrose, the historian who devoted his career to studying the American soldier of the Second World War, offered a verdict that would have bewildered German planners of 1941. When Hitler declared war on the United States, he was betting that German soldiers, raised up in the Hitler Youth, would always outfight American soldiers, brought up in the Boy Scouts. He lost that bet. The Boy Scouts had been taught how to figure their way out of their own problems. The German surrender came in May of 1945. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years. The Wehrmacht that had conquered most of Europe was shattered, its cities burning, its industry destroyed, its soldiers trudging into captivity by the millions. The American forces that had been dismissed as dollar soldiers stood victorious from Normandy to the Elbe. The final months of the war had stripped away any remaining German illusions. American forces crossed the Rhine in March of 1945, using a combination of audacious assault and overwhelming firepower that exemplified everything German commanders had come to fear. When the bridge at Remagen was captured intact on March 7, American engineers immediately began constructing alternative crossings while infantry poured across the damaged span. Within 5 days, multiple pontoon and treadway bridges were fully operational, carrying the bulk of traffic. When the Ludendorff Bridge finally collapsed on March 17, it was an anticipated event rather than a crisis. The replacement crossings had already rendered it redundant. The logistics system that had sustained American advances across France operated with the same relentless efficiency on the far side of Germany's last great natural barrier. German resistance in the final weeks was sporadic and increasingly futile. Some units fought with the desperation of men who believed surrender meant death. Others dissolved as soldiers shed their uniforms and melted into the civilian population. The fanatical core of Nazi true believers staged last stands that accomplished nothing except additional casualties. The professional soldiers who remained calculated their odds and sought the best available terms. The race to surrender westward became a dominant feature of the war's final days. German units on the Eastern Front conducted fighting withdrawals designed not to defeat the Soviets but to reach American lines before the Red Army caught them. Commanders who had sworn oaths to Hitler prioritized the survival of their men over ideology. The preference for American captivity, universal by this point, drove operational decisions at every level. American forces processing the flood of surrendering Germans encountered soldiers who expressed relief at their capture. The propaganda that had painted Americans as racially inferior mongrels had been replaced by a reputation for relatively humane treatment of prisoners. German soldiers who had witnessed or participated in atrocities on the Eastern Front particularly valued the distinction between American and Soviet captivity. The voices of German soldiers who lived through this reversal are preserved in remarkable detail. The United States Army's Foreign Military Studies program produced approximately 2,500 manuscripts written by captured German officers between 1945 and 1959. These documents, housed at the National Archives and the Army Heritage and Education Center, include detailed interrogations with figures like Dietrich and Bayerlein and Manteuffel. More revealing still are the secretly recorded conversations gathered by British and American intelligence. Historian Sonke Neitzel discovered and analyzed surveillance transcripts from approximately 14,000 German prisoners of war who spoke candidly to each other without knowing they were being monitored. These recordings, generating roughly 150,000 pages of transcripts published in his book Soldaten, capture German soldiers expressing views they would never have shared with interrogators. Liddell Hart's post-war interviews with Rundstedt and Blumentritt and other senior commanders provide the perspective of the men who had directed German strategy. Cornelius Ryan conducted over 1,000 interviews and gathered more than 3,000 individual accounts for his History of D-Day, including extensive conversations with German participants. These sources require careful interpretation. German officers writing after the war often blamed Hitler for failures while burnishing their own reputations, but the broad consensus that emerges from this evidence is consistent. German forces discovered that the American military system, while producing individual soldiers who may have lacked the tactical polish of their Wehrmacht counterparts, generated something far more dangerous. An adaptive organism that learned from mistakes at institutional speed, backed by industrial power that rendered tactical virtuosity irrelevant. The German reassessment of American soldiers between 1943 and 1945 stands as one of modern military history's most dramatic reversals. It moved through distinct phases: ideological contempt, tactical dismissal after Kasserine, growing concern through Italy, alarm in Normandy, and shocked respect during the Bulge. But the underlying lesson is simpler than the chronology. German forces discovered that their analytical framework had been fundamentally flawed. They had confused a nation at peace with a nation incapable of war. They had mistaken cultural diversity for military weakness. They had looked at civilian prosperity and seen softness rather than the industrial capacity that would bury them. They had failed to see the capacity for transformation that would emerge under pressure. They had failed to imagine the factories that would crush them beneath an avalanche of steel. They had failed to anticipate the organizational learning that would turn green troops into veterans in months rather than years. The hierarchy of German fear is itself instructive. They did not most fear the American rifleman. They feared the American system. The forward observer with his radio calling in massed artillery within minutes, the fighter bombers that made daylight movement suicidal, the logistics chain that could abandon mountains of ammunition and replace them overnight, the replacement depots that ensured destroyed equipment reappeared the next day. Rommel grasped this earliest and most clearly. His comparison of fighting an air-dominant enemy to a savage against modern European troops was not about American soldiers' individual courage. It was about the recognition that industrial democracy had produced a new kind of warfare that professional military tradition alone could not answer. The Wehrmacht's man-for-man tactical edge, real as the statistics confirm it was, proved as strategically decisive as a swordsman's skill against a machine gun. History does not repeat, but patterns recur. The German generals and intelligence officers who dismissed American capability were not stupid men. They were capable professionals who let assumptions override evidence. They saw an America they recognized from their preconceptions and ignored the America that actually existed. The cost of their misjudgment was measured in the millions of German dead, in cities reduced to rubble, in a nation divided and occupied. The assumptions that had seemed so reasonable in 1941 proved catastrophically wrong by 1945. The American soldiers who fought across North Africa and Sicily and Italy and France and into the heart of Germany were not supermen. They were clerks and farmers and factory workers who learned to fight because circumstances demanded it. Many of them died learning. The survivors became the teachers who trained the next wave. The organization as a whole grew more effective even when individual units struggled. These ordinary Americans achieved what German military professionals had declared impossible. They became soldiers, they mastered modern warfare, and they won. If you found this history as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these forgotten chapters of history. Each story matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, from veterans and their descendants to students of history. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive. The lessons from this history are not merely academic. Nations still make the mistake of seeing what they expect to see rather than what actually exists. Leaders still dismiss capabilities they do not understand. The gap between assumption and reality can still be measured in lives lost and wars prolonged. The German generals who underestimated America paid for their error with defeat. The American soldiers who proved them wrong paid with their blood. Understanding how that misjudgment happened and why it was so complete may help prevent similar errors in the future.